Hi, I am Josh. Welcome back to my channel. Today is a wrap up for all the books that I read in April. This month I read about 12 books, exactly 12 books, not about, and I read about 3,800 pages. So this is about the third month in a row that I've gotten to about 37 to 3,800 pages, which gives me a good idea how to plan my TBRs in the future, which is good. It also does not bode well for May because I'm pretty sure I may have overestimated my abilities there, but it also means I've got my stride going again, which feels good. It's always disappointing when I expect to read so much and I always undercut it. So now getting a better idea of what my new pattern of reading is, for the moment at least. This month was an okay reading month. I mean, I read a lot of great books that I really enjoyed reading, but very few were like top tier. And when I go through them, I usually have it from best to worst, but now I have it from like highest rating to lowest rating. But since I don't have the books here to show you, I cannot as easily just stack them in a way that's like relative to one another, even like say within a 4-star range. But with that caveat, let's get started. The first one that is probably the best that I've read this month is the Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, and this one here was a delight. I read Bradbury's other book, Something Wicked This Way Comes, last year. I think it was, maybe in 2019, and I struggled with it because the writing was kind of dated, but the tone was perfect when it came to like a good horror story. But I was worried because of the writing style of the other one that would not work as well for this one. I have read his other book, Fahrenheit 451, in high school, and I love it. But this one is an anthology of short stories about humans going to and colonizing Mars. And it was written in like 1950, so it's very dated, especially when it comes to the Mars science, but it's still so much fun despite of that. I don't know what the predictions were for what Mars would be like at the time, but he treats it as if it is a very Earth-like, maybe with a slightly different atmosphere. It's not very Earth-like, obviously. It has a very thin atmosphere, virtually no atmosphere at all, I mean, relative to Earth, but he essentially creates this world where he hypothesizes what it might be like when we colonize Mars. That's an anthology, it's just a short story collection, and it goes from that very first moment we start to colonize to when it is completely colonized. It's a serial of short stories which each stand alone more or less, but they all build on the previous one. So every one, you don't want to read it out of order because then it might not make as much sense, and I think it really does flow well. And while in doing that, we have just the general notion of like critiquing what it would be like for people, for humans to inevitably try and colonize another planet, and he doesn't take a very kind look at it, I think, which is one reason why I really like it. While I'm a planetary scientist, I'm very big into space travel. We recognize that humans, especially the US specifically, have a very colonial mindset, and we have this idea that if it's there, it's ours to take. And Bradbury does not let that sit very nicely. He gives us this Martian population, which is this indigenous population, which gives us this opportunity to have this conversation. And I just thought the book was first off, it's really fun to read and like really well written, but also like it just the way we moved from one thing to the other, it worked really well. And within all these stories, which make their own book, they still stand alone as being unique among one another. We have stories that like are science fiction, we have stories that feel like fantasy, we have stories that feel like horror, and all of that is in this one tiny book. All these different types of stories, all telling one overarching story, and I loved the variety. I loved how well it came together. I wasn't sure when I first read this if it was going to be 4.5 or 5. I've since come to realize that it's absolutely a 5-star, probably going to be a favorite of the year, honestly. And if you want the audiobook, it's narrated by Scott Brick, who does a lot of classics, a lot of dystopian type stories, which is in a way a dystopian tale. Hopefully I didn't give away too much. I think it was just the overarching idea, and I highly recommend this if you haven't read it yet. Great book if you like sci-fi and planets. Moving on to our 4 stars, which now that I realize that like of the 12 books, 9 of them are 4 stars, although I may actually say they're 3.5. I haven't decided yet. Let's go with the Obblescape. This is the last book that I finished last month, almost said last year, and I like this story. Like it had everything that I remember loving about the first book. The problem was because the story is the world is so finely crafted. I spent a lot of the book struggling to remember, trying to understand who was who. Like, I remember what happened in the first book, I remember our characters, but I don't remember their names, which means when we get here, I'm trying to remember, okay, who is this person? Like, is this the same person from this part of the story? And the way the story is told is so unique as far as like perspective-wise, and that helps distinguish between, at least some of the characters. Now, at the end of it, I was able to figure out, like, these are these people, but it was still a little bit confused as far as the world building, and I feel like I'm gonna have to reread it, but even before then, I'll probably have to reread the first one. I feel like the most conducive thing to do here is just to reread the entire series at once, which I'm kind of frustrated because, and this is personal though, I'm frustrated at myself because it shouldn't take having to reread every book every time to enjoy the entirety of the story. It's just there's so much there that I know I missed. Despite enjoying what was there, I feel like it's one of those books where I have to reread it to really appreciate everything I had to offer. But it's a solid continuum to the book, and I'm excited to see where it goes. The question is whether or not I'm going to read the last one before I reread the first two. Next is The Planets by David Sobel. This is a nonfiction, historical, but also science book. And this was written in 2006, so it's a bit dated. But I thought, despite the fact that it was very dated, I thought it was a very solid book. I thought it did a really good introduction to the planets, to the science of the planets, and the history of the planets. If you're someone who doesn't know much about the planets, I highly recommend this book. If you do have like any familiarity with the planets, especially if you're like me, a planetary scientist, you might find this book somewhat unnecessary because it's so introductory. But personally, as a scientist in the field, I found the way in which she told the narrative very informative. Not just because like there's always bits of information that you don't know, or I don't know that I get from it, but it's also the way in which you communicate science. That's an art that is only learned with time. Being able to read from communicators like David Sobel, who herself is not a scientist, but who is a scientific journalist. She's written many books like this, is very valuable, which is why I very much appreciated this book. And despite the fact that it's pretty much very outdated, we've had several missions to update this stuff, there was a lot that she was able to talk about. One thing I really liked about it is because it's also a historical story. She doesn't say, okay, this is what happened, here's what we learned, and now this is what we know. It was much more like we were jumping around between the science facts and the science history, weaving it in a way that makes it not just like a history book, but instead a story about the science with some fun history like woven in there. And then it's that way in which she weaves it in that I think really made it work so effectively. I think the main reason I didn't give it more was because it is still very introductory and it's still a little bit dated despite the fact how well it works. Next is Moon of the Crusted Snow. I really like this. I don't know why I'm hesitating. I really like this book. I did. Honestly, it's probably between 4 and 4.5. Maybe I would put it at 4.5. This is a dystopian horror science fiction book, but it's a survivalist horror, I think is the best way to describe it. It isn't like horror movie horror, but it's like I think it fits in the horror genre as far as the tone goes and the way in which the story is written. The story is really good. Like from the get-go, like we realize we're in this dystopian world where something's happening, and I'm listening to this and I'm walking out of my kitchen looking at my cabinets thinking, am I prepared for an apocalypse, for a dystopia? Am I ready for this? I would not survive. And I was just like, I was feeling distressed, like, God, I'm not ready for this. I'm not gonna ready for this. And it was just really well told. And then when we get to the big bad of the actual story, I feel like it was definitely hinted at and alluded to. And in a lot of ways, you probably should see it coming, but I don't know if I quite did. I guess I didn't expect it to be the real big bad of the overarching narrative, but I thought it ended up working out really well as the big bad. I don't want to go any more detailed as to what it is, because I don't want to spoil it, but I thought it made for some great overarching criticism of society as it is and of history. Solid book. Highly recommend it. So the more I talk about it, the more I want to settle on 4.5 stars, so maybe I will. Next is A Song Flung Up to Heaven by Maya Angelou. And this was book 5 or 6. I think it was the 6th one because I think I only have one left. In her autobiography series, this one she narrated herself. I really liked this. It was so great to be able to hear a full audiobook, full version of the book in audio narrated by her, because so few of them are. The first one is, this one is, and I think an abridged version of book 4 is. And so from that perspective, it's like a unique experience because you get to hear her articulate all of it, and the way in which she speaks is so soothing, so moving, and I highly recommend listening to her narrate this if you're going to read it. I also recommend reading it. This was a period of her life, I guess best described as, I think this was like just before she was about to write her first memoir, I think was what happened like towards the end of the book. But this was right as or right after Malcolm X died, and we see this relationship in which she was building to work with him shattered, and it really gives us an opportunity to see the civil rights era through her eyes and also critique it, and you get a unique perspective of that moment in time in a way that isn't as clouded by history, because we have this idea of the civil rights era of MLK being universally loved, and obviously he was a very hated man, as was Malcolm X. And I found this discussion that she has really reflective of that. One of the critiques I often have of these books is that since they are a series of autobiographies and memoirs, they do feel like they fit into a larger narrative. But this is one that I think, I don't know what had happened in her life, but she clearly had made a conscious effort to make this a standalone, because it felt like she did a bigger job or a better job sort of introducing us to this point in her life, give us a context as to where she is in her life and how she got here. So it's not just this like here's where we left off, here's where we start. It felt more standalone-ish, which also might be part of why it's so popular, part of why it got its own narration, because of the fact that it was, I guess, intended to be like a way to bring in more readers. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that was the impression that that's what I got from it. And next is Near the Bone by Catherine something, I don't remember, but it says a arc that I got, and it wasn't on my TBR originally. It did not fit into the Buzzword Readathon, which I forgot to mention. I participate in the Buzzword Readathons. Everything here is somehow related to space and space terms. And I decided to read this because after reading Moon of the Crusted Snow, I just realized I am not reading enough horror this year, and I was like, one a month is not going to cut it. So I have this arc. I want to read it, so why not? And it's already out, so why not read it? Why not listen to the audiobook? And I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. This book wasn't like as nuanced as Moon of the Crusted Snow, but it was a solid ride. It felt like a fun horror flick, and I feel like it would make for a great film. It is essentially like three different horror stories in one. You have survivalist horror, you have this sort of maniac serial killer, and you have a monster flick, all crammed into one. And how well they weave together, I don't think is entirely effective. Like it does sort of feel like she's just splicing three different stories together, but all in all, it wasn't that bad. It flowed well enough, and I actually listened to this, I think, all in one night, one evening, one afternoon, because like I didn't want to stop. I was fully invested in our character, even if the characters themselves weren't even that great. The story starts with this young woman who is in a very abusive relationship with this man, her husband, and they live in this secluded cabin in the mountains. And when they start seeing these giant bear claws in the sand, in the dirt, that's from a bear that seems way too large to be any bear they've ever seen, some things begin to unfold. We begin to learn things about them and about the world and about this monster, and it turns into a wonderful slash flick, like I already said. And I thought it was a solid, fun ride, which is why I gave it 4. Qualitatively, like the quality of the book, maybe not be 4 stars. It sounds kind of pretentious, I guess, but I felt like my enjoyment was enough to bump it up there to a 4. Oh, Christina Henry, that's what it is. It makes me want to read more of her books too, because of the fact that like it's like a Stephen King. It felt very Stephen King-esque. You know, you don't go to Stephen King for like a nuanced story. You go to it because it's just a fun ride, right? And I think that it's definitely what she has to give us here. A critique I have, though, another critique at least, that I think comes with being sort of Stephen King-esque, is that Stephen King isn't nuanced. He writes characters that often are caricatures. It's getting dark, it's about to start raining, so. But he writes characters that are one-dimensional in the sense that, like, when you have a bad guy, he or she just does the most obscene, disgusting things. There's no nuance to him. We're just meant to hate them, and it works. Like that's an effective way of making you hate a character, which, you know, it gets you emotionally connected, or it gets me emotionally collected, and so I get it. It works, but it's still not that. You're not doing anything particularly special, and that's cool. The character, the way it was with some of the characters in this book, even the characters that weren't big bads, there were teenagers in this book that felt a little caricature. They were in some very severe situations. I felt like those would have been more sobering than they were, because there were times where they just forget where they are, what the fuck's happening to them, and they just start being like your ridiculous teenage self who does and says stupid shit. It didn't fit the story, in my opinion, and I think it goes into the idea that the characters just weren't that well fleshed out. If that bothers you, I can understand why, but, you know, this is the kind of story I think you want to come to not for that. I was invested enough with our main character, the wife of the man in the cabin, but still I can't say that it was particularly that great of characterization. That was a very good but mesh book. I spent a lot of time talking about it, but, you know, it made a lasting impression, didn't it? Next is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, and I was doing a vlog for this. I need to stop advertising my vlogs before they're complete, because I just don't think I want to. This book was fine. I gave it 4 stars, but honestly, it's probably more like 3.5. I think I rounded up to 4 actually online. I just didn't update it on my slides. This book, I don't know. I get it's praised, and I get it's just really well crafted world. But, you know, I get kind of bored a lot of the time. When it's good, it's really good. When it's not, it's not. And maybe I need to give it the next one a try, because this one definitely had one particular part. Tom Bombadil is usually acknowledged as being a waste of time. Maybe I only didn't read enough about it, but that was my impression from what I read online. It's those extra pieces that were added to it. I think this doesn't work as well. I think the movies are better than the books. I did listen to this using a fan-made audiobook where his voice was near professional, not quite professional, but really added to it was he used sound effects as well as music from the film throughout of it, and generally it worked really well. There were a few times where the sound effects and music just made it impossible to understand what he was saying, and it worked pretty well. I think it made it easier for me to stay in the book and maintain that feeling from the film. But right now, I have too many other things that I'm more invested to read than continuing the series. I am curious if you think that the rest of the books are better, or based off what I've said, you think I enjoy the others more. I was supposed to read all 3 of them last month for a book club, but I don't do that. I didn't want to invest that much time in something I just wasn't thrilled about. So 3.5 stars. Like, I didn't hate it, but definitely a disappointment, that's for sure. Next is The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. This one's a solid 4 stars. I've only read a couple of Ursula K. Le Guin's, and I've had sort of hit or miss with her, just because her writing is, I feel like, more cerebral. It's very detailed world building often. And this one I felt like wasn't quite that. It was more mainstream. The fact that I enjoyed it made me think it's more mainstream. I solidly enjoyed this. It's about this man who seems to think that his dreams will change reality, that if you dream something, it will sometimes make it true. And I was in love with this premise. I kept having to pause the book because it's one of those premises that just make me stop and think to myself, what would it be like to be in this world, to have this power, or to think I had this power, and have to ask myself, is this shit real? Like, as a scientist and a skeptic, I love fantasizing about this kind of situations where you're in this possible situation where you're so sure about this thing being reality, but it's hooked into your perspective as being the proof, which is inherently fallible. Like, if I were to think I saw something fantastical, like, I have to question my own sanity, because I am more likely to be insane than the nature of reality being broken. And it's trying to think about ways in which to scientifically test these claims that I think is just so much fun. The book doesn't go in the directions I want it to, but like, they set up certain, she world builds this premise, and she gives us certain understandings of how it can work, how it can be abused, and with certain assumptions, I think it is definitely testable to an extent. There's only so much you can prove something like this, but I found it, the premise, just so much fun to fantasize about. The book ended up taking it in a different direction a little bit, but I thought it was really fun. I think the main thing was, it's basically the idea of, you know, a mad scientist abusing the power. I think it goes into pretty dark places. It asks some really big questions. It's still very Le Guin, in the sense that it is meant to be used as a way in which to question certain ideals, certain perspectives. You have this utopia, where you have various forms of utopia that are more dystopian than you might think, and I thought that conversation was like top tier. I definitely would put it above the obblescape, I think, because it's like one of my top 4-star books that I read. Solid book, and I love the premise so much. Like, it was really why I picked it up in the first place, was because of the premise, and it did not disappoint. So I recommend this book. I think it's a solid book, solid sci-fi book, and a solid classic book. I've read several classic sci-fi books, which I'm counting as classics, by the way, because, you know, a classic is a classic, right? Speaking of classics, next up we have 2001, A Space Odyssey, and this one felt very different than the movie. And many say that it was written based off the movie, but I think instead it was written in tangent. There's the introduction here where Arthur C. Clarke talks about his motivation behind this, what went into making this, and the idea was he's not much of a script writer, so instead he'd write a book. And then it wasn't Zemeckis, it was the other guy who was that did The Shining. He would have adapted it into the script, and there were certain iterations and certain things were changed, and I thought it did pretty good, especially when it comes to the science. There were some fun, interesting ideas of what worlds would look like that they got pretty wrong, but still like a fun idea. What surprised me about this was that I always remember 2001: A Space Odyssey being an AI narrative, which maybe I'm wrong to think that, but I think the beginning of that movie always feels so weird, but in the context of the book, it makes so much more sense, because it's not an AI narrative. The AI is one piece, this larger puzzle, this larger conversation, and I felt like it worked a bit better in that sense. But I still enjoy the movie more, honestly. I think the book is still a bit of a, I don't want to say it's a mess, but when it comes to how it all fits together, I don't think it's as effective as the film, because of everything it's trying to explore, all the different ideas in science and science fiction. It just isn't as effective as an overarching tale. It's still a really fun one, personally. I found an obscure narration of it by Michael Kramer, you know, who does all these fantasy books, and that was fun. It was a fun narration, and I also didn't realize the story went further. Whenever you watch the movie now, I think if there was a piece of the ending I just didn't get, or if it's supposed to be alluded to or not. But like, it reminded me a lot of Interstellar or Contact, the movie based off of Carl Sagan's book. And now I'm wondering whether or not those books or films were inspired by this because of that. But it was not, didn't disappoint, but it wasn't top tier either. Where would I put this book? Probably above The Fellowship of the Ring. Nah, maybe around near the bone, maybe slightly above near the bone, I'm not sure. At the bottom of the 4 stars. And now we have the last 4-star, getting towards the end here. We have When the Moon Was Ours by Anna Maria McLemore. This one was definitely a higher 4-star. Was it a 4.5? I'm not sure. This book, for some reason in my TBR, I call this like a retelling of Peter Pan. And you know why? It's because I saw stars. When I see stars in the night sky, I think Neverland for some fucking reason. I don't know why, but it wasn't that at all. It was instead, what was this? Ooh, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful and magical realism type story about these 2 figures, these 2 kids who had this bond, this relationship. It explores them, their identity as a person, and when it comes to their gender, but also I guess how they fit into society. And I loved how it was all woven together. Because of the framing of the story, the type of story that it is, it's hard to nail down what exactly the plot was. I think the themes are what you really want to get from here. The themes and the tone from Anna Marie McLemore, and it totally had that. It was set in the modern day as opposed to their last book, which I read, which was Blanca and Roja, which felt more like a fantastical setting. Maybe that wasn't fantastic. I don't know. I picture it being that, but this one was more modern day. And I actually had to restart this after first reading it because I was confused about the introduction, which was I felt like a fairy tale being told, and I wasn't sure how it connected to the main narrative, and I sort of realized that the characters all, I think, meant to be connected in that way. But I'm going to stop talking about this because I don't think I have a lot of coherent thoughts to give on it, unfortunately. But it's all a book that I recommend. Where would I put it in the listing here? I would say I'd put it in the top 4 tier, around The Obelisk and A Song Flowing Up to Heaven. I'm not ranking these very well, but let's just keep going. Next, we have a book that was kind of a disappointment. This is an anthology, Alien Sex. It's short stories by Ellen Datlow. Ellen Datlow does a lot of horror, some science fiction, some fantasy stuff. This is more science fiction with a touch of horror. These stories are meant to be, like the name suggests, about alien sex, but not quite literally alien, because it's meant to be any forms of sex that are alien to us, whether it be taboo sex, bestiality in a couple places, or literally alien sex. It's about to start raining. I have to either move this or hurry this up. And some of the stories didn't work. Some of them felt unnecessary. Some of them felt like they had the wrong message. Like this one story about a teacher in a Catholic school sexualizing his students, and I felt like that did more just to like fantasize than it did to actually critique. I mentioned bestiality. It was one story that was definitely meant to critique, but I just didn't feel like, despite critiquing, that it felt necessary. I'm not going to say it should have been written, that you shouldn't read it, but I also am slow to recommend it. I think if the premise seems exciting to you, then give it a shot. But I can't say this book is particularly good experience if you don't have that underlying interest there. One last book here. We have The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene, and dear God, I probably would have read more. I listened to so many podcasts, watched so many videos the first half of this month because I read this book and I didn't love it. It was also 3 stars, and honestly, it was his first book. It's about string theory, and he's written several books since then. I have to admit, I can't keep doing this. We are back. Just like that, it stops raining. I think it's lighting up all of a sudden. In this book, I felt like I was hoping for a more detailed understanding of string theory. Unfortunately, the book is 2 decades old. So instead, I come to this book, and I felt like extra stuff I didn't understand. I'm not sure if it was trying to give more than what I already knew, but a lot of what I read that I understood, I already knew. And part of that problem, of course, is that this isn't a new idea anymore. It's been around for so long, and I was still somewhat familiar with it, and I'd heard enough about it to know most of it, and I don't think I've gained much from this. If you haven't heard anything about string theory, you might find this useful. There were a lot of people who read this book and thought it was really good. I just wasn't one of them, but I also think there are just better resources out there when it comes to string theory. And I talked about this book in another video. I did not, but I have a huge review, and I have so many resources on there if you want to just be familiar with it. On Goodreads, I'll link to it below. I'll include the links in general to different videos if you're curious about string theory, modern day takes on it, modern day discussions of it, which I think were more effective than and more concise than the actual book. I do feel like I gained a little bit from the book, but generally speaking, like I said, it's all stuff that I already knew. It did what it was supposed to, which is to say get me excited about the idea. But as a book, I didn't love it. So like, I don't know, I can't recommend it, but I do recommend the basic idea, and I recommend his other books too. Maybe I should send a long review. Like I said, I have a whole huge review written up on Goodreads because I talked all about this. My mind was erasing about it. Such a thought-provoking book, if not, in my opinion, a very effective book. So those are all the books that I read. Thank you so much. If you stayed to the end here, if you did, give me like a picture of a string or something in the comments, something string-esque. And as always, hope you all stay safe, and I will catch you all next time, okay? Bye.